Hello, Creative Writing. So I wanted to do a quick run through on our lesson this week. I'm going to have you guys actually go back through this on your own and read more of the examples. But I just wanted to walk you through our theme this week is recognizable people, which is basically character development. And I would argue that um, developing your characters is probably the most important component that you can do in a story. You can have a lot of things run flat in a story, but if you don't have a good character, uh, or so, the other way, if you can have a lot of things going really well in a story, but if you don't have convincing and likable characters, and I use likable not in the sense that you have to like every character emphatically, but a character that is believable and moves you, it's not going to really take off. Okay? All right. So again, one of your main goals as a writer, if you're doing character-based plot, is you want to make characters that people believe in and they care about. Okay, I mean, look at what Disney and Sony and all these other companies have done. Some of these characters have been around a long time. Mickey Mouse has been around for a really, really long time. Okay, everything in a story really revolves around your compelling characters. Okay. A way to think about this, I got a picture of an iceberg here because I think it's appropriate. Um, you want to think about when you're putting your characters down, you know, what are their physical features? What are their mental talents? Are they good at math, terrible at French? What kind of emotions do they have? Consider that all your characters have histories. They're going to have pasts, they're going to have memories, they're going to have hopes and dreams. Okay, even if they kind of keep those bottled up at first, they are going to be present. Okay. Um, Here is a quote by Ernest Hemingway. Oops. Okay, and some of this is cut off, unfortunately. Let's see if I pull this down a little bit. Only 10% of what the author knows about a character actually appears in the story or nonfiction piece, but if he or she doesn't know the other 90%, then that will be apparent to the reader. The character will appear lifeless, not believable, flat in some way. So, some ways that I would describe the importance of that. I've seen writing workshops where people actually sit down and they just describe all these things about their characters. They don't always end up in their story, but they try to really work through them, figure out who they are as a person. Even actors, you get method actors like Johnny Depp, for instance. Um, I think he still does that. But when he takes on a role, he'll oftentimes never leave that character. Um, and so, like when he's having interactions with his friends outside of the set or with his wife or whatever, he is that character. And I can imagine that would be quite trying to, to those around him. But I think he does it as a way to really explore who this character is. Like, what would Jack Sparrow be like in a coffee shop or going to church on Sunday? Um, I think the same kind of holds true for us when we're creating characters. Don't just have their little tiny world that you're thinking of. You want to go much bigger than that. Think again of your characters as like a big iceberg. You get the tip that you see in the movie or see in your story, but there's so much more underground. And a lot of times, if you don't have all that stuff planned out, if you ever write a sequel or something, or you want to keep developing the character, you won't have that stuff there. Okay. I know a lot of authors who are like, I want to revisit this character and really try him again. There's some memorable characters that we see that are getting kind of their second win and getting another go. Ewan McGregor as playing Obi-Wan in a TV series. Fantastic job in the Star Wars films. Well, more or less. Um, but I'm glad that they're going to explore more facets of this character. I think that's what a good character does, is if you know more about them, you can explore more. Okay. Um, okay. Other things that you want to keep in mind about characters, guys, is you want to avoid having too many flat characters. Now, I used to teach flat characters as one having only one major personality type, and in some ways that's true. But I've since, well, I'll talk more about that in just a second. But for our purposes, when you think about like flat and round characters, a flat character is one that is incapable of surprising us. They just um, don't really do much along that way. They just kind of fit a stereotypical role. They don't act in any complex way. There's not even much emotional depth involved with them. Round characters, on the other hand, are just the opposite of that. I think the most important thing that we can keep in mind in all this is they are capable, I'm filming here, capable of surprising us. They could have an unexpected fit of anger, or they could have an uplifting sense of humor suddenly. They could make a snide remark just all of a sudden to a presumed friend. More importantly, they convince us. Okay? So this is from E.M. Foster. I'm going to scroll down here again. If characters never surprise us, then he or she is flat. If they surprise us but do not convince us, they are flat, only pretending to be round. Okay? So, that takes a little bit of skill to make convincing characters. I'm not saying that it's easy, but it is worth the work. And again, what is the hinge pin for the success of many stories? So when we consider a few round characters, we've read some of these things, or maybe some of you read on your own. If you read The Lady with the Little Dog, Gurov is a character who, believed himself incapable of falling in love until he met Anna. And through the course of the story, he finds that he can't treat her just as another run-of-the-mill affair. Okay? Same thing with Connie from Where Are You Going and Where Have You Been? We didn't end up reading that in class, but if you ever get a chance to read the story, it's really creepy, but we do see that she is a round character. At the start, she seems like a self-centered, selfish girl, but then she turns out of being capable of making, the ultimate sacrifice, of protecting her family. Okay, she ends up going with this creeper guy named Arnold Friend who threatens to hurt her family if she doesn't. Okay. All right. Now, a few things to keep in mind. You want to mostly populate your stories with round characters, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a flat character here and there. In fact, they serve a really important function. They can sometimes influence the round characters, motivate them in some way, or make them come to realizations. And again, just in real life, there's some characters who pass into our life and pass out just without us giving it much of a second thought. So, for instance, if you're writing a story and someone is in a diner, for instance, you can have the waiter bring your food, okay, and they don't necessarily have to be round. Sometimes a waiter just needs to be a waiter who brings food and fits that stereotypical role. Another thing that I want to throw in here, because this is how I taught this differently, not every round character needs to be dynamic, meaning they don't have to have a big dramatic change. You get some characters, I got Walter White here and Jesse Pinkman. These are very, to me, round characters who are just so dynamic and change a lot. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at a character like Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, he's not overly dynamic to me. He doesn't seem like he changes much in the story. But on the same note, he's incredibly interesting. I think he's one of the most beloved Charles Dickens characters ever. And I used to teach him as being flat, but I would say that he's round, but certainly I wouldn't say he's dynamic. Okay. Sometimes your characters can be static in that they don't change. Okay. But I will say just in sum on this point that you do want your story to be populated with round characters. Okay. Now, we've talked about this a lot in previous sections, guys, but you do want to focus on creating characters by focusing more on precise and peculiar elements in some ways rather than just making general statements. Well, I guess to start off here, you don't want to be completely off the map when you're describing characters, their little quirks and things that make them unique. You don't want them to always behave in unexpected ways. So you might think about certain things like if a person is attending a funeral, it's generally accepted for them to act sad or bereaved. I mean, that's something expected. Or if a person attends a wedding or christening, they're generally happy, okay? But again, you can still focus on things like the peculiar, okay? Let me pull out of this for just a second. This is the one quote I am going to read to you. So this is from Gustav Flaubert, and this is what he says about characters, okay, which I think is excellent counsel. When you pass a grocer seated at his shop door, a tailor smoking his pipe, a stand of hackney coaches, show me that grocer and that tailor, their attitude, their whole physical appearance, including also a skillful description, their whole moral nature, so that I cannot confound them with any other grocer or any other janitor. Make me see in one word that a certain cab horse does not resemble the 50 others that follow or precede it. There are not in the whole world 2 grains of sand, 2 specks, 2 hands, or 2 noses exactly alike. Okay, so I do again think that that is excellent counsel. So even when you're doing a flat character, for instance, make them unique. Okay, you can take some time. You know, I know I kind of favor Stephen King when I'm talking to you guys, but he is excellent at building characters and making them believable and focusing on the peculiars that would make you recognize that person. You know, just if you saw them on the street, you would know. Okay. Here's a few examples that you might look at. I have those on that same document I just showed you. Okay. In each of these examples, we see general or expected behavior in situations in the question, but we also see peculiarities with these characters, not in a strange way necessarily, but things that make them unique. I would strongly encourage you guys to read through these. Another thing you want to avoid when you're doing character descriptions is the idea of consistency. Okay, you don't want to have your characters always act in a consistent way, and I think that that is a formula for boring. Okay, that again doesn't mean that you always have to go off the rails, make them act crazy, but you do again want to surprise your readers. Let them see different facets and angles of the characters that you're developing. Okay, so for instance, a man, for instance, might love his family, yet he acts in ways that puts them in danger or harm them or even himself. A woman may value her job, yet continually put it in jeopardy by seemingly senseless, self-destructive behavior. You know, one example that comes to mind, this is actually from a memoir and a real human being. I read a memoir called Educated by Tara Westover, and her father is one of the most interesting characters I've ever seen, and he's based on, you know, he's a real human being. And you can tell in the story that he loves his family, but he continually acts irrationally, and he does decisions that, you know, jeopardized her life and her family's life many times. And again, I don't think it's purposeful. I don't know how well he thinks through his decisions, but you know, that's one of those books that you're like, oh man, someone has to die at the end of this chapter. But anyways, that would be one that I'd recommend if you, I mean, that's a nonfiction example, but those characters in that story are just so interesting. Okay. Okay. I don't know if any of you guys do any drama, but there's an expression that's sometimes used, directors might say, is not acting in character. And typically this is seen as a bad thing because it's either the actor's not acting what the director expects to see. And this is sometimes the biggest headbutt that actors and directors will have, is how they want characters depicted. Okay. But I will also say that not acting in character is a good thing. Okay. So again, it's the character surprising us by something he or she is doing. I would say maybe the bad version, if we, for our own purposes, is a character acting in surprising ways, but it's not convincing. Okay, so you can have characters act irrationally or do other things. Hey, Millie, you got to be quiet, babe. Get out of here. Okay, act irrationally, but maybe it doesn't really follow through. You know, I've seen many times where I'll watch like a sitcom or something, and I just don't buy the romance. I just don't buy the behavior. It just doesn't do it for me. I don't feel like there's a good transition. Okay. I put this example of Michael Scott. He loves doing improv, but his fall 2 is always pulling out a gun, and he eventually kind of gets kicked out because it's boring, I guess. Okay. All right, a few other things that we might consider here too, guys. Ways to build up characters is consider what they look like. Okay, Adam Sandler is, I don't think he has a ton of characters, but he can always create some interesting characters. If you've seen Hubie Halloween, it's kind of silly, but and I actually hate that kind of character that he does, but there's certainly no mistaking kind of his descriptions that he has. Okay, thinking about what a character says, what a character does, how they act, even just what a character thinks and feels. Now, when we think about what a character looks like, it's very difficult to come up with a compelling character without giving some sort of physical description. Okay, but you also want to keep in mind that physical description doesn't only have to be their immediate body, what they're wearing, what their hair looks like. This could also be their environment as well as their possessions. Okay, Raymond Carver, an example that you look at, one of the characters is described as he looked like he just came from a concert. I think that that is very telling in itself. Okay. Sometimes, again, what a person possesses. We're going to do an activity, I think, later today where you are considering what's in a person's pockets. Okay, and what that is telling. Mel, you got to get out of here, sweet. I'm recording. Sorry, guys, this is hard to do at home. Sometimes physical descriptions can help us see that characters are not dealing with things well, like aging, for instance. Okay, so again, these are all examples that I've given you that you might look at. Thinking about what a character says. Okay, I think that that is really important. And not only the manner, or not only what they say, but the manner in which they say it. Consider their vocab, their syntax, if they misuse a word or general diction. I was trying to think of the character's name from Much Ado About Nothing or Nothing from Shakespeare. He's the detective, and he constantly mixes up his words, and it just makes him such an interesting character and so funny. Okay, he oftentimes will call the person who's guilty the plaintiff. Okay, getting things just completely backwards and mixed up. Okay. Jamie Conway, I've meant to read this book a long time, and I finally did it this week in Bright Lights Big City. He is such an interesting character to me. This is a story I told you about that's completely told in second person, like out of the person's head, where he's watching himself act. It's so interesting to hear him have negotiations with himself, and we find out at the end that a big part of the things he says and what he avoids saying deals with his trying to make sense of his mother's death. Okay, and we don't really learn that till the end of the story. Thinking about what a character does. Okay, you've heard the expression "actions speak louder than words." What is a character doing? How do they behave? Okay, and this could be in reaction to other characters or just things that are happening in society. Okay, here's some great examples here of how that would play out. Okay, we also want to think about what a character thinks and feels. That is a huge component, and this varies between your points of view. You might not always, if you're not omniscient but just objective, you're not going to know what a character might be thinking. Okay, but you can still give hints of that. Okay, they can act or speak in certain ways that can insinuate those ideas. Okay. Okay, another idea. Characters influence plot. We talked about this a lot last week, but just to kind of develop the ideas a little bit more. Plot, again, is simply kind of causal things that happen. But again, that revolves around characters' choices and the reactions to things. Okay, so here's a few interesting components that you might think about. Characters take action or create plot points. Okay, characters can be acted upon, and this can be by others, by God, by nature, etc. Characters can remember things, and then the fourth one, characters can imagine things. Okay, we'll talk about each of these in sequence here. Characters can take action. Okay, characters' decisions influence plot points. They make things happen. Sometimes what might appear to be a subtle decision or a subtle mistake can make a whole story. It can completely turn things around. Okay. Characters can be acted upon by others. Okay, by God, nature, etc. You want to keep in mind just in real life that things can happen to characters independent of their own actions. You know, people do things to us in real life that we are not necessarily deserving of. The same thing can happen to characters. Okay. And that certainly can cause plot points to unfold. It's not always their decisions, but again, it's their reactions. Here's some great examples from that happening as well. You know, one of the best things we've talked about, I think, that characters can do is doing flashbacks. This can give us backstory. As you've seen from Sonny's Blues, flashbacks don't have to happen in chronological order. It can kind of vary the structure of a story significantly, but it can be very telling and move the plot forward as well. Okay. I think one of my favorite components we might think about is characters can imagine things. Okay. They can fantasize, they can have daydreams, they can have projections. Okay. Here's an example from Flannery O'Connor, but I think one of my most favorite examples, and one I'm actually going to have you read this week, is The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. I realize some of you might have read this in a previous year, but I think it's worth looking at again. Walter Mitty, the whole story of his life, in the short story, is his imaginings kind of influence and shape him as a character. I think the movie Walter Mitty, the one from a few years ago, is fantastic. I'm going to try an experiment. I don't know if this will play out well, but I had two clips, but I'll just show you one. Okay, so in that clip, I hope that came through okay. Walter Mitty, again, read Cheryl Milhoff's eHarmony account, and she talked about, for one, having a dog that had 3 legs, and then she listed all those things of what she's looking for in a man. And so for him, that kind of formed the basis of this imagination that he had. And throughout the whole course of the movie, he oftentimes goes back and forth between reality and what he imagines in his head. If you've never seen the movie, I think it's worth, you know, a weekend watch just to see this character development. I love how the movie plays out. I think that's one of the more interesting characters I've ever seen. So that's something worth looking at. Another thing that drives characters, guys, just as we're getting close to the end here, is their wants and needs. Characters act, what I would say a big hinge pin on plot is characters' desires. Okay, we talked about they can choose to act or not act, how they react or not react to something. Okay, and these again don't have to be big grandiose things. The Joy Luck Club, this opening scene that I put a clip in for you guys. This is when Amy Tan is a young girl, or her character's a young girl, and she desperately wants to get something from a grab bag, a good present. Okay, we see this in like Charlie Brown. I love the Charlie Brown clips. Okay, Charlie Brown shows up to his Valentine's Day party, just hoping and desiring that he'll get Valentines from someone. So he brings a big briefcase, hoping that he can fill it up. But as it turns out, in the end, he doesn't get one. But this clip shows, you know, what he'll go to receive some sort of attention. Okay. And then Metamorphosis, a great example. Okay, Gregor wants desperately not to be a burden on his family, and so you see him finding instances after he's transformed to a cockroach that he hides under couches and beds just to kind of be out of the way and out of sight, so they don't feel so grotesque looking at him. Okay. I think one of the more important components is thinking about characters and relationships. And I'm not only talking romantic, I mean relationships like with their parents, with their friends, with other people, with their enemies. Okay. Think about how characters act differently around different people. And again, that you want that to be convincing. You know, I think one of the greatest romance shows that I've seen is How Harry Met Sally. Okay. Great dynamic, okay, between those two characters, Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal. Okay, great story. Okay, great dynamic. You get to see them in many different situations over the years. Okay, I put some great examples here, but the key thing is you want it to be believable. You want it to feel authentic. Okay. And that's again where you might sit down and say, how would my character react if they were with this character? Or how would they be in this situation? Is you want to know all the intricacies as much as you can before you start writing. Okay. All right, you guys, that's all I have here. I would again encourage you to read through some of these examples on your own. But I will stop here and let me come back in.